We'll start off this section by taking a quick tour of the JBoss folder itself. From here you can see that there's an app client directory which basically contains some libraries for FAT clients or clients that run as Java clients on a third party, on another machine somewhere. We'll start off We'll start off this section by taking a quick tour of the JBoss EAP 6 folder itself and then move into the standalone directory structure. The key folders in here are the bin directory, which contains the scripts that you're typically going to use to start and stop your server instances, maybe the vault script for configuring the secure storage of passwords and so forth. This is a fairly important file as well, the standalone.conf and the domain.conf. In these files, in the conf files, you'll find the ability to manipulate the startup options of your Java virtual machine. So your heap settings, for instance, your MS and MX settings for heap and max perm size, etc. If you want to make changes that are reasonably persistent, then you would typically modify one of these configuration files. Back in our folder structure, we also have the docs directory, which contains the schemas that are used throughout. They have some useful documentation in them if you need to look at verification of what settings might be available for different subsystems. It can be often useful to actually look at the XSD files. The other useful stuff in here is the examples directory, which contains a bunch of other shipped standalone configuration files that you can leverage to help build out a standalone instance. Of course, the settings that are in here potentially can be reused within a domain configuration as well, although not all of them. So what else do we have? We have the domain folder, which is where we'll look at in the next section. The modules we briefly took a tour of in the Unit 1, and standalone. The other folder that's possibly useful to know about is the welcome content. This is actually the root web application if you don't define a default root web application for a site, for a JBoss EAP server instance. And when you first point to port 8080, for instance, the content that's being served up is coming from here. Within the standalone directory itself, you'll find a number of subdirectories. Depending on whether you've previously started the server or not, you might not see all of these folders when you first come in here. If you've already started the server, then you should see all of these folders. Generally speaking, you'll have a configuration directory which contains, as the name implies, the configuration files. And of course, standalone.xml is the default one, but the other profiles that we talked about in Unit 1 are in here as well as a number of properties files for containing user and password pairs if you haven't configured your security to be more tightly locked down, and some logging properties files. You'll see later on in discussions that we have that when you use the management console or the command line interface, that the underlying infrastructure for management keeps backup copies or history of changes that you've made, so you can find the historical changes in the XML history folder. This allows you to revert back to a previous configuration if you need to. The other folders, deployments, as the name implies, will ultimately contain deployments of applications. The lib directory will potentially contain libraries that might be needed by your applications or the applications that your developers have shipped, although generally the preference is to bundle them as deployments or modules now. That's not to say that libraries aren't still potentially a valid option. Not recommended though. It's there more for legacy purposes. And that brings us on to the other three folders that generally get created when a server instance starts. The data folder is a temporary storage location for applications to put data into, including the application server. Data that might be used during things like compilations of JSPs and stuff like that. Temp is a scratch pad that applications can use, and also again the application server can use during the compilation phase as well. And of course the log folder for containing the boot log and the server log itself. So when you need to go looking for a problem, you would look for them within the relevant log folder here. And that pretty much covers our folder structure. The thing to remember is that when you first start the server instance, the data, temp and log folders won't necessarily exist until you start the server. Lib generally avoid using unless you have a real reason to do something with it. You'll see later on, if you've got hot deployments turned on, then the deployments directory can be used to auto deploy, and of course the configuration directory for our configuration purposes. Storing your configuration in a subdirectory of your JBoss EAP instance might not be desirable when it comes to doing things like upgrades and so forth at a future point in time. So there is actually a couple of switches that you can pass in to the startup of your application server instance. And if we flick back across to our standalone.conf file here, you could potentially, for instance, add -d java.home.dir, which sorry, not Java, JBoss. Habit, my apologies. jboss.home.dir, which with a relevant directory would allow you to specify the root folder that JBoss is in. This is probably less likely to be used than this setting, which would be JBoss server .base.dir. This allows you to nominate a directory with a path that points to the standalone folder, roughly the equivalent of this folder here. So you could move the standalone folder to somewhere else in your file system, such that in a future upgrade of the product you're maintaining or preserving your configuration as it currently stands, and being able to quickly reuse that if you needed to. Alright, we will do a demonstration in the next screencast.